Greetings, Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on medieval church history. Last time we devoted a session to the life of St. Bede the Venerable. Today we brought that up to the year 731. So in this session we will conclude, hopefully, with Bede's life. Specifically, we'll begin in the year 731. In that year, he wrote a letter, St. Bede wrote a letter to one of his former pupils named Egbert. Egbert was the cousin of the sitting king of Northumbria, and he was the brother of the next, and Egbert would become Bishop of York. All of this in what is now northern England. Then it was a separate kingdom of Northumbria. This letter is significant because it allows us to precisely date the origins of the structure of medieval economy, politics, society, and a particular category of church-state relations within that framework. And that whole structure, that whole construct, has been given the name feudalism by historians, because they have to call it something. So I'll read an excerpt from the letter and then analyze it, because the rest of the medieval history is not going to make sense without understanding feudalism. And the particular malfunctions, I mean, it wasn't all bad, but there were, in terms of church and state relations, there were particular malfunctions within the system of feudalism that led to, or that contributed to the Protestant movement and the rift within Christendom that divided, that still divides Christians. Anyway, okay, so the letter was written in the year 731, but internally, as we'll see, Bede dates the beginning of the phenomena to the year 704. Okay, so Bede, the servant of Christ, to his most beloved, the Right Reverend Bishop Egbert. So Egbert had just been named Bishop of York. Health. So there's a lot in the letter, so I'm going to skip down to section 7 of the letter. Quote, "Consider what a heavy crime is committed by those who diligently seek earthly lucre from their hearers and take no pains for their everlasting salvation by preaching, exhorting, or rebuking them." So he's writing about bishops. This is a problem at the level of bishops and abbots. "Weigh this most anxiously and with the most careful attention, most beloved prelate, for we have heard it reported that there are many country houses and hamlets of our nation, situated on inaccessible mountains and thick forests, where for many years no bishop comes to perform any of the duties of holy ministry or divine grace. Yet none of these are free from paying tribute to the bishop. And yet, not only is there no bishop among them to confirm by the laying on of hands those who have been baptized, but they have not even any teacher to instruct them in the truth of the faith and in the difference between good and evil. Thus, some of our bishops not only do not freely preach the gospel and confirm those who have been baptized, but do what is worse, for they receive money from their hearers, contrary to God's command, neglecting the ministry of the word which God ordained them to preach." Okay, that sets it up. Now, skipping down, this is a very, very long letter, so I'm skipping down to section 11. Quote, "And seeing that there are many such large establishments, which, as is commonly said, are of use neither to God nor to man, because they neither observe regular monastic life, nor yet supply soldiers or attendants to the secular authorities to defend our shores from barbarians. For, disgraceful though it be to say it, so many estates have been received under the name of monasteries by those who know nothing whatsoever of monastic life, as you yourself know better than I, that the sons of nobles or of discharged soldiers can find no place wherein to receive their possessions, and thus, having nothing to do, and not marrying, though past the age of puberty, they are held by no tie of continence, and therefore either go beyond the sea and abandon their country, which they ought to fight for, or, with still greater wickedness and imprudence, not being bound to chastity, become addicted to luxury and fornication, and do not abstain even from the very, actually, the Venerable Bede gets a little too explicit next, and I want this to be family friendly. So anyway, you kind of get the picture. So skipping down to section 12. But others who are laymen and have no experience of the regular monastic life, nor any love for the same, commit a still greater scandal. For they give money to the kings, and under pretense of erecting monasteries, they acquire possessions, wherein the more freely to indulge their licentiousness, and procuring these by a royal edict to be assigned over to them in inheritance, they get the deed by which privileges are confirmed, as if it were a matter worthy of God's notice, authenticated by the signatures of the bishops, abbots, and secular authorities. And thus, having gained possession of farms and villages, they free themselves from every bond, both human and divine, and in the character of superiors over monks, though they are but laymen, they do nothing therein but gratify their desires. Nay, it is not monks that are there assembled, but all such as they pick up, outcasts from other monasteries for disobedience, or men whom they can allure away from other monasteries, or, in short, such of their own followers as they can persuade to receive the tonsure and promise monastic obedience to themselves. With such ill-sorted societies do they fill the cells which they have built, whilst they present a disgraceful spectacle, never before heard of. For at one time they are occupied with their wives in the care of raising children, and at another time they rise from their beds to occupy themselves with the internal concerns of the monastery. Furthermore, they display the same folly in procuring land for their wives, as they say, to erect convents, and these, equally foolish, though also of the lay state, suffer themselves to become the superiors over Christ's handmaidens. Well suited to them is the proverb that wasps, though they can make combs, yet store them with poison instead of honey. Skipping down, section 13. Thus, for about 30 years, ever since King Alfred was removed from this life, and that's the internal dating to the year 704, because that's when he died, our province has, meaning Northumbria, where Bede was living, our province has been involved in such folly and error that there has not been a single prefect since that time who has not furnished himself during his prefecture with a monastery of this kind, and involved his wife also in the guilt of such wicked traffic. And thus this custom has prevailed, and the king's ministers and servants have bestirred themselves to do likewise. So that numbers of men have been found who call themselves abbots or prefects, or ministers or servants of the king, who, although as laymen, they have learnt a little of the monastic life, not by experience, but by hearsay, yet are utterly without share of that character and profession which is required to teach it. And indeed, such men, as you know, on a sudden submit to the tonsure and of their own judgment from laymen, become not monks, but abbots. So skipping down, there's more to that, but skipping down section 14, but then further down in section 14. It is your duty most diligently to inquire into whatever right and wrong is done in all the monasteries of your district, that no abbot who is ignorant of the rules or who despises the thing, and also that no unworthy abbess be placed over any society of Christ's servants or handmaidens. It is your duty, I say, to provide lest the devil usurp the sovereignty in places dedicated to the Lord, lest discord take the place of peace, strife of piety, drunkenness of sobriety, and fornication and murder reign instead of charity and chastity. Skipping down, section 17. Thus much briefly have I said against the poison of covetousness. But if I were to treat in like manner of drunkenness, feasting, luxury, and other contagions of the same kind, my letter would be indefinitely lengthened. May the grace of the chief shepherd ever keep you safe for the wholesome feeding of his flock, prelate, most beloved in our Lord. Amen. Okay, the letter is much longer, but this suffices to begin our analysis. So Bede was concerned by the practice he observed of land-owning families privately endowing dioceses, monasteries, and convents in order to place younger sons or daughters in charge. This would exempt the lands with which, I should clarify, today when we say endowment, we mean money, cash or stocks or something. But in the medieval period, this is a money-poor economy. So land was the basis of wealth. So when these people endowed, that means land. They put aside land for these things. So the land that they're taking part of their own land, building a monastery, endowing the monastery with a piece of their land. Then, since it's on their estate, they're in charge. And then they put a younger son. The oldest son always inherited the estate. So they put a younger son in charge of the monastery, or put a daughter in charge of the convent, because then they would not have to pay a dowry, for her to marry. But the advantage being that those lands, because of the developments we covered under the life of St. Isidore, those lands given to the church would be exempt from taxation. But because members of their family were in charge, the land would still be used for the benefit of the family. All right, let that sink in. In a sense, this is a tax dodge. That they have these big estates, and they'll take, say 500 acres. They'll spend the money to build a monastery on it. Endow, take those 500 acres, say now this is for the monastery of St. Jude. And then that land, that 500 acres, is exempt from taxation. And they put a younger son in charge, so he starts calling himself abbot. As Bede said, he may know absolutely nothing about the monastic life and have no interest in it, but, this is not a free society. Medieval society is not free. So, the families arrange, just as families arrange marriages, they also arranged to send children into religious life or not. So the younger son is in charge, but he's still beholden to his father. And then later his older brother, when his older brother inherits. So that younger son is exempt from military service. He gets the title of abbot. and then they recruit. Then this younger son might have buddies of his own who don't really have anything to do in life because they're younger sons. They're not going to inherit. So, well, okay, kind of a monastery. So we have this land, and they're not working it. The peasants are working it for them, and so then they're taking that's part of what Bede was saying. Now, he was referring to bishops doing it, but it was the same with monasteries and bishops, abbots and abbesses. Not all of them, of course, but those created as part of the tax dodge. They would just take the money but not do any of the ministry. Okay. This, in Bede's Anglo-Saxon context, was called Bocland, B-O-C-L-A-N-D, or that means book land. So that means a piece of property that has a charter defining its dimensions and defining the privileges that go with that land. So it's recorded in a book. So this is Bocland. It's not just the wild Sherwood Forest. That this is as we would say surveyed land that's recorded. So this is the first written evidence that has survived of the emerging medieval political and economic system of feudalism. Now, in some histories of the Middle Ages, the writer might use different terms. They might use the term feudalism for the political and social system, and use the term manorialism for the economic system. So, just in case you encounter that, to define these terms, the term manorialism is derived from a manor house of a regional lord. He owned land, he managed its production, conventionally for raising crops or breeding animals, or some topographic specialty like fishing or mining, whatever happened to be in the area. Etymologically, the word manor, as in manor house, M-A-N-O-R, not manners as in behavior, but M-A-N-O-R, manor, comes from the Latin verb manere, which means to stay. So the manor house is where the Lord stays. So manorialism, referring to the economic system, means that the manor, the guy in the manor, the Lord, manages the production of the estate. So that's that part of the economy. The term feudalism, that's F-E-U-D-A-L-I-S-M, is derived from a different Latin word, a medieval Latin word, feudum. That's F-O-E-D-U-M. Because of sloth over time, languages always tend to contract. So feudum is better known in English as a fief. F-I-E-F, a fief. So a fief was simply a piece of land with a charter defining its size, use, and any privileges. So fief is the Latin word for the Anglo-Saxon Bocland, for bookland. So they both mean the same thing. It's just Bede was writing as an Anglo-Saxon, so Bocland is the word they used. But in Latin, in medieval Latin, it's a fief, a piece of land with defined size, use, and privileges that are recorded in the records. Since this was the basis, in a money-poor economy, land was the basis of the economy, and the political system and social system, of course, is built on the economic system. So this would be the structure of society and the churches within society into the early modern period. So now we're going to take it apart in pieces to see this, to understand all the dynamics, simply how things were done in the Middle Ages. So to summarize, first, the background. So nothing just happens. That's just a basic principle. Nothing just happens. There's always a reason. We might not know it. It might not be immediately apparent, and the reason might be stupid, but there is always a reason if you dig deep enough. So the background. First, ancient Rome, going way back into the Republic, but before the Empire, to the Republic. Ancient Rome had a very well-developed body of property law. Property could be bought and sold in measured units, either by private individuals or by corporate entities. Such property could be as small as a private dwelling, or it could be a huge estate. For our purposes, the background that's most important is the huge estate. So for the Romans, both in the Republic and later in the Empire, a giant estate was described with the term latifundia. Latifunddia. So that's a combination of two Latin words. Latus, the prefix latus, meaning wide or spacious, and fundus, the suffix, meaning farm. So a latifundia is just a huge farm. And that term is used to describe large-scale production estates. This is an ancient plantation, essentially. The empire, the Roman Empire, was, of course, not a free society. It was just a very thinly disguised military dictatorship. It's not a free society. Those who worked on the latifundia were either slaves or they were freemen who worked the soil. And the Romans had two different words for that. So a slave was a servus. A freeman who worked the soil was a colonus, like colony, plural would be coloni. And that's from the word meaning to cultivate, to till, to cultivate the soil. In the year 332, ironically, in an effort to slowly eliminate slavery, after Constantine legalized Christianity and the church started to have more influence, our ancestors, we tried to eliminate slavery. So in 332 was the first step in that direction. The Emperor Constantine passed a law that slaves on a latifundia who were freed were to remain coloni, meaning that they would be legally bound to remain on the estate. So what's the difference between that and slavery? Well, the difference is that they could no longer be bought and sold as individuals. But if the estate was sold to someone else, they remained on the estate. They just worked for the new owner. But that new owner could not sell them, could not bring them personally to the slave market and sell them. So this was an attempt to slowly eliminate slavery from Roman society. By the medieval period, slavery had, for the most part, disappeared from the Catholic parts of Western Europe. But since the concept of a colony being tied to the land remained, the medieval Latin term, as distinct from the classical Latin term, the medieval Latin term serf, S-E-R-F, was applied to them. So that's a contraction of the older Latin word servus for slave. So even though the serfs were not slaves, they were the descendants of the coloni, so a serf could not personally be bought and sold on a slave market, because the slave markets had largely been closed, but they were still tied to the land. So if a duke who owned this estate sold it or lost it or whatever to pay a debt, then the serf still had to work that land. He just worked for somebody else. Okay, second, background development. Parallel to this, as the seminarians know, we covered in the ancient history, the Patristus course, was, again, going back before the empire to the Roman Republic, a legal and social construct called the patrocinium clenare relationship. That's a patron-client relationship, recognized and protected by Roman law. So patrocinium just means a patron. Clenare, client, it did not mean then exactly what it means now. So it's derived from the Latin term clenare, which means to lean. so you lean on. So the client would lean on the patron, meaning that so now we think of the client, like who goes to a lawyer. Well, the client's paying the lawyer, so the client is actually the boss. But that's, even though the word has remained, the usage in the Roman period was different, in that the patron was the boss, and the client, the patron and client entered into a relationship of mutual advantage, but of differential power. So the patron was in charge. The patron was generally, would always be wealthy, had some position or influence, and means to help the client. So the client would pledge fealty. They wouldn't use that term, but would enter a relationship of service to the patron, and what that would be would depend on the person's specialty. Maybe it was a bodyguard or escorting the guy around to protect him, or someone more specialized, maybe a translator, or somebody who knew how to handle money for the guy. But it would be the client would be his man. And in Roman law, a patron and client could not be made to testify against each other in court. And it often happened in the Roman period that the relationship between the patron and client was actually much closer and tightly bound than the relationship of the patron with his own family, because the patron-client relationship was personal, and when the patron died, that was not automatically handed down to the patron's heir. The heir might decide to take that client as his own, but it wasn't automatic. So whereas in the patron's family, the wife and the patron's children might want the patron to die as soon as possible so they could inherit. Whereas for the client, it was to the client's advantage to keep the patron alive as long as possible. And the patron would help, in various ways, paying debts, arranging marriages, arranging housing. Oftentimes ex-soldiers, if they might have known each other in the legions, and their officer, an officer might be from a patrician family, and then, some of the grunts, who were not, when they get out of the army, they, okay, what are we going to do? So then they would enter into that kind of relationship with their former officer. So if this is maybe kind of sounding familiar, remember, Italy is the land where the mafia came from, and so that kind of arrangement of the loyalty that's derived from this patrocinium clanare relationship, and that endured after the empire fell. That was still part of the memory of the old imperials. One way in which the patrocinium clanare, patron-client relationship, could be established would be if a patron paid a debt or assumed some other responsibility which the potential client could not. If the patrocinium relationship came about in that way, then a different word would be used. Would be a vadari, V-A-D-A-R-I. That's the Latin word meaning to cover. It's like bail, like covering bail. Like the patron would bail the client out of a situation, and it could be literal, because remember, debtors' prisons existed in the Roman Empire. So if you couldn't pay a debt, you could just rot, or you'd be sold into slavery to pay the debt. From this etymological origin, early medieval Latin derived the term vassus for servant, and vassalus for a servant who was a retainer rather than a serf. The distinction being that a retainer, a vassalus, a vassal, was not legally tied to the land by birth, but rather was tied to the person of the Lord by this personal arrangement, whereas the serf was tied to the land by birth into that particular class. So this usage, vassalus, the Latin vassalus, was later Gallicized into medieval French as the term vassal, an essential term in the context of feudalism. Third, background development from the barbarian side. So those first two came from the Roman context. So now, the barbarians, these Germans and Scandinavians, coming in, later Slavs, Hungarians, they're coming in. They have their own cultural context, which, remember, is tribal. So when they came into the empire, these tribal societies did not have the concept of units of private property. Instead, the tribe would have a region. I agree. Say the Alemanni. Okay, so the Alemanni, our tribe controls the region between this river and that mountain. And we as a tribe will fight to defend it. But they did not have the concept of Sven owns this acre. They just didn't have that concept. But they did have a hierarchical mentality, like the Romans did, although the mechanics of the hierarchy were different. For the tribal societies, the Germans, Scandinavians, their hierarchy was based on publicly declared oaths of loyalty to their chief. So they bring that concept into the empire. As the empire fell, they retained that with the successor kingdoms. In the successor kingdoms, they encounter a population of old imperials. So the first 2 points, the first two dynamics, that synthesizes with what the barbarians brought in from their tribal context. So the barbarians come in and they see these latifundiae, these large estates. And they inserted themselves as a military aristocracy, essentially, over the old imperials, imposing political ascendancy by coercion. And as we covered in previous lectures, these old imperials, either they decided to fight to the death, or they reached some accommodation, with the new overlords. More often than not, these barbarian chieftains would simply move into the villa, which had been the center of the latifundia estate. Serfs on these estates continued doing what they had always done, just work the land. So a change in lord didn't really mean anything to them. So instead of having some Roman patrician telling them what to do, then they had a German chieftain telling them what to do. But whatever they were doing, raising crops or raising animals or whatever, they still had to do that. So, life still sucked to be a serf. Fourth, background contributing development. As early as Constantine's legalization of Christianity in the year 313, and again, the seminarians know this from last year's course, so I'll just refresh your memories that once Constantine legalized Christianity, he began using public funds, meaning taking money from the fisc, the public treasury, to endow the church with buildings and estates. Now, initially, this was compensation, restitution, for all the unjust, the murders, during the 250 years in which Christianity was illegal and Christians were tortured to death and fed to animals, So initially, partially, it was restitution. This meant that when the barbarian successor kingdoms formed in the previous imperial provinces, the church was already integrated into the latifundia system. So, as we saw it, we converted the empire from within, and the church got endowed in this way. Now, not every church, not every was paid for by the fisc, by the government, but some were, and again, there's no separation of church and state. So the barbarians come into this situation where there were dioceses and monasteries and convents that had been endowed with latifundiae, with estates worked by serfs to support them. Fifth, the process which we covered in the first year course, covered the kind of cultural anthropology. Whenever cultures come together, There are a series of very predictable reactions, predictable patterns that occur. Among those are the process of acculturation, assimilation, synthesis, and syncretism. So, and the influence, when cultures, the influence is never in one way. It's always, they both influence each other. And then something new and different is created. That's the synthesis and syncretism. Synthesis is the combination of previously distinct ideas. Syncretism is the combination of previously distinct practices. So all of that process resulted in the following system. A fief, a unit of land, would be granted by a lord to someone else who became his vassal. Now that vassal might himself be a lord over others, from king to duke, depending on the country. Could have viscount, earl, margrave, landgrave, count, I said count, baron, later in history baronet. So there were all a whole series of titles. This exchange took place in a public ceremony in which oaths were exchanged that included mutual obligations. The lord owed the vassal protection. The vassal owed the lord payment, either in coin or, more often, a percentage of the goods produced, either food or animals, whatever, wool if it was sheep, fish, and the vassal owed armed service to the lord if he needed it. The precise details of the size of the land, the nature of the oaths exchanged, the duration of the tenure, whether it was a lifetime tenure only, in which case the fief would revert back to the lord, or whether it was hereditary. Remember, Bede mentioned that there were some cases where it was hereditary, where the fief would be passed down to the vassal's heir. All these details were recorded, usually by clerics, who, for reasons we covered previously, were staffing the bureaucracies of most of the successor kingdoms in the early medieval period. And they organized them into archives for future reference. After our ancestors converted these barbarian tribes, converted the successor kingdoms to Catholicism, kings and noblemen continued the practice of using public funds, the treasury, the fisc, to build churches, abbeys, convents, and endow them with fiefs for their support. Now that's just the way things were done. So no one had enough money to just create a financial endowment like we do today, so it was done with land. And it was not always bad. If the people involved were sincere, if the bishop, the abbot, the abbess, and those, it could produce great results, as we'll see. There were many positive developments. But the fact that this system was protected by law presented an opportunity for those with a certain frame of mind, the kind of people who want to exploit the law, or go around the law, or manipulate the law for their own personal advantage. So they used this legal structure in a way for which it was never intended, that did harm to both church and state, and did harm sacramentally to the sacrament of holy orders, as well as the sacrament of matrimony. Because the purpose of neither, sacramentally, the purpose of marriage is not just to get another piece of land for the family, and correlatively, the purpose of holy orders is not to create a tax dodge for the family. So that all of that is an aberration, that was never intended, and was not universal. The abuses were not universal, but they did occur. And that brings us back to what Bede observed, that there were those who took advantage of this so that the land could still be exploited for family gain, enjoying the immunities and privileges of it being ecclesiastical land, by the simple expedient of installing a family member as a clerical lord or abbess over the diocese, monastery, or convent. So all that's the background about the problem Bede complained to in his letter to Bishop Egbert. Some landowning families had done this, and the harm, as Bede observed, was not just the tax dodge, so they were depriving the kingdom of tax money, but it was also harming the ecclesia, the church, because these younger sons and daughters forced into religious life without a vocation, they felt no obligation to fulfill their duties. And that's what Bede observed. They're not preaching. Those who were, made bishops this way were not confirming. They didn't care about the people. They weren't serving the people. They weren't bringing them sacraments. They weren't teaching. They weren't passing on the faith. Yet they were still taking money. They were still, the serfs in the villages still had to work for them. So that, taking without giving. Now, in the normal course of things, some in this situation simply accepted it and just went through the motions until they died. A few had conversions and achieved real sanctity. This is what happened to Thomas Becket. He certainly went into the church for the wrong reason, for political gain. But something happened. He had a conversion, and he ended up becoming a martyr. So that did happen. But then there were still others that Bede was pointing to, who allowed resentment to turn them to total corruption. And that brought scandal to the faithful and harmed the mission of the church. And as I said, since this is a church history course, and as a priest, I'm focusing on the damage to holy orders. But also note that this also harmed the sacrament of matrimony, because marriages were arranged too, and they were done without regard to the children's vocation or wishes, and often the bride and groom may have never even met each other, and this is okay. You're just going to marry this person. So, okay, this system would be the norm in Europe and did not even begin to unravel until the 1300s. And even then, it endured for centuries until serfdom. So that's how we know when the system ended in these countries. So remember, serfdom, a serf is legally tied to the land. So in order for that to end, the law has to be changed. The first was England, outlawed serfdom in 1660. France was next, outlawed serfdom in 1789. That sounds familiar. That's the French Revolution. That's how long it endured in France. Italy in 1860. Russia in 1861, Germany in 1870. So Bede identified this beginning in 704, and it endured in some countries until the 19th century. So there's no doubt that this integration of the church into the political and economic system did bring many benefits to the church. There's no denying that. So many of the beautiful cathedrals and monasteries and convents that still survive in Europe they only existed essentially because the government paid for them. Public funds were used to pay for them. Now, there are many stories about people contributing to help build them. That certainly happened. But many of those, could not have happened without tax money, contributing to it. So that helped. Another advantage of this integration is that the church had real influence had total control of education for a time. I mean, really until after the year 1000. Certainly the church had total control over education, and also had influence over the setting of policy, some influence over setting law. So we did eliminate slavery from Europe, from Western Europe. Ideally we could have gotten rid of serfdom sooner, but we did eliminate it. It was a major achievement. So slavery did not re-enter into the Western context until the exploration, that's the early modern period. So there was good and bad. And feudalism was simply the way things were done. Like today, it's capitalism, at least in the West. The things we take for granted. We have banks, we have a stock market, we have Social Security, we have credit cards. And that's just the way things are done. And it can be good and bad. There are good things about our system and there are bad things about our system. So it was the same way with feudalism. There was good and bad. But focusing on the church, taken as a whole, this is a major contributing factor in understanding why so many turned on the church during the Protestant movement, and why so many of the previous movements, like the Albigensians and the Cathar movement, why each time one of these movements came up, these dissident movements, there were so many who turned on the church because of this problem, that from their lived experience, some even though they might actually have a bishop, but the bishop might live on his family's estate and never go to his diocese. The abbot might not live in the monastery, but he's still taking money. Or the crops, the animals, whatever it produces. So they know they're being neglected. This was not a free society, so there wasn't much they could do about it, but people aren't, they know if they're being had, if they're being used. So that explains why so many were willing to turn on the church. And this is something that has nothing to do with the faith. Nothing at all. This is not in the New Testament. Jesus did not mention any of this. This was not created by the church. But the church exists within society. Like now, in the United States, we exist in a capitalist society. We didn't create it, but we live in it. So we have to do the things the way things are done. We use banks, we use credit, we do, because that's just how things are done. So it's the same with the church in feudalism. We didn't create it, but we still had to function within it. And we in both the good and the bad. So that's the point I want to make. All right, so Bede, let's see, to conclude with him, Bede died on Ascension Thursday. And that year, it fell on May 26th in the year 735. He died at the age of 62. Pope Benedict XVI assessed Bede with very high praise. And this is just a part. Quote, "In fact, Bede became one of the most outstanding erudite figures of the early Middle Ages, since he was able to avail himself of many precious manuscripts which his abbots would bring him on their return from frequent journeys to the continent and to Rome. Bede's teaching and the fame of his writings occasioned his friendships with many of the most important figures of his time, who encouraged him to persevere in his works, from which so many were to benefit." That means his writing. He was a very prolific writer. When Bede fell ill, he did not stop working, always preserving an inner joy that he expressed in prayer and song. He ended his most important work, the history of the English Church and people, with his invocation: "I beseech you, good Jesus, that to the one to whom you have graciously granted sweetly to drink in the words of your knowledge, you will also vouchsafe in your loving kindness that he may one day come to you, the fountain of all wisdom, and appear forever before your face." So death took Bede on May 26th. As we said, it was Ascension Thursday at the time. Okay, so that's it for Bede. We will end now, and the next guy we'll cover is St. Boniface, which will take us to Germany. So for the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.